Hundreds of years ago in the 14th century, something terrible happened across Europe. A deadly disease spread rapidly and killed millions of people. Today, we call it the Black Death. It was one of the worst pandemics in human history. The disease didn't care who you were, whether you were rich or poor, young or old. It could strike anyone. But some people survived. How? That's what we're going to talk about, how people back then could have made better choices to avoid getting sick. And no, simply saying, don't get sick, wasn't good enough. You had to think smart, act fast, and avoid danger wherever possible. First, let's think about where you live. This was probably the most important choice you could make if you wanted to survive. Many people lived in big, busy cities like London, Paris, or Florence. These places were full of people, trade, noise, and unfortunately, disease. At the time, cities were dirty and crowded. There was no running water, no plumbing, and no proper way to get rid of garbage. People threw trash and even human waste into the streets. It smelled awful, and it attracted rats. And those rats carried fleas, the tiny bugs that spread the plague from person to person. So if you were living in a city in 1348, your chances of catching the Black Death were already very high. In these cities, houses were made of wood and packed tightly together. Most homes shared walls. People lived close to their neighbors, shared markets, and gathered in large groups. That meant if one person got sick, the illness could spread quickly to many others. There were no hospitals like we have today, and the medical knowledge at the time was very limited. People didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They didn't understand how the disease really spread, so they couldn't protect themselves properly. If you wanted to survive, one of the smartest things you could do was to leave the city. Go somewhere quiet, away from crowds. The countryside offered more space, fresh air, and fewer people. There were still dangers, of course, like wild animals or harsh weather, but there were fewer rats, fewer fleas, and fewer chances of running into someone already infected. Even better were remote villages or monasteries. Monasteries were quiet places where monks lived and prayed. Some groups, like the Carthusians, lived almost completely alone and rarely spoke. They didn't mean to create the perfect quarantine environment, but that's exactly what they had. Their lifestyle kept them away from danger without even realizing it. Let's imagine a typical moment in 1349. You're at the market, buying onions. Suddenly, someone nearby sneezes. What do? Today, you might hand them a tissue or say, "Bless you." But back then, you ran. Because if someone started sneezing or coughing, there was a good chance they had the plague. People didn't know the exact cause, but they knew being near someone who looked sick could be deadly. Some believed the plague was spread by bad air, something they called miasma. It wasn't totally correct, but it led to some smart behaviors. People started avoiding crowded spaces, skipping markets and festivals, and staying home. Some even moved to small cottages or family farms to wait out the worst of the plague. Entire families survived simply because they shut their doors and didn't open them again for months. Was it lonely? Absolutely. But it was also safe. Letting someone sick into your home, even a cousin or close friend, was risky. A single mistake could infect everyone. Wealthy families had the money to escape more easily. They packed their things and left the city early. Some stayed in the countryside, drinking wine and reading poetry while the cities fell apart. Poorer people didn't have that choice, but those who understood the risk and chose to stay away from others had a much better chance. Every social interaction could be dangerous. Even a handshake or shared meal could lead to death. So if you were the kind of person who stayed home, avoided parties, and didn't talk to strangers, you might actually survive. Now, let's talk about what you wore. It might seem silly, but your clothing could affect your chances too. In the Middle Ages, rich people wore long, heavy robes made of thick fabrics like velvet or fur. These clothes weren't just stylish, they were perfect hiding places for fleas. If a flea got into your cloak or sleeves, it could live there for days and bite you when you least expected it. That meant your fancy clothes could literally kill you. People who wore simpler clothes, shorter tunics, tighter sleeves, and lightweight fabrics like linen had fewer places for fleas to hide. Linen also didn't attract fleas as much. If you were lucky enough to wash your clothes regularly, which was rare back then, you were even safer. Some communities went so far as to burn their clothes if someone got sick, hoping to kill any hidden fleas. That wasn't a bad idea. Fleas can live without a host for days and still carry the disease. What about armor? You might think a knight in full armor would be protected, but the plague didn't care about armor. You couldn't fight it with a sword. In fact, heavy armor trapped heat and sweat, making it a great place for fleas. Plus, you couldn't exactly wash your armor easily. It might make you look brave, but it didn't help with survival. Accessories didn't help much either. People wore necklaces, perfume, and bundles of herbs around their necks, thinking they would protect them from bad air. Sometimes, the smell kept others away, which helped a little, but it didn't stop the plague. The most useful thing you could wear? Clean clothes and a cloak that didn't smell like 3-day-old stew. Let's talk more about hygiene. People in the 14th century weren't known for being clean. Earlier in history, some societies had bathhouses and better habits, but by the time the plague hit, people had stopped bathing regularly. Doctors at the time actually believed that washing too much could make you sick. They thought hot water opened your pores and let bad air in, so many avoided bathing completely, thinking it was dangerous. Of course, the truth was the opposite. Fleas loved dirty skin, especially the kind hidden under layers of sweaty clothing. People who washed their hands and faces, even just with water or herbs, were less likely to attract fleas. Soap did exist, but it was either homemade or expensive. Still, a few people managed to stay relatively clean, and that helped. Laundry wasn't common either. Most people wore the same clothes for days or even weeks. Rich people might change outfits once a month, but that was considered fancy. Some survivors boiled their linens or beat their clothes against rocks to clean them. It wasn't perfect, but it helped remove fleas and lice. Even chewing mint leaves or rubbing salt on your teeth was better than nothing. It didn't cure the plague, but it kept your mouth from smelling too bad. So, could a bath save your life? Not directly, but it could reduce the chances of carrying fleas, and that gave you a better chance. It also made people avoid you because you smelled strange, as in clean. And during the Black Death, being avoided wasn't such a bad thing. The Black Death didn't spread evenly. Some places were hit hard, while others escaped with fewer losses. One big reason was geography. Where you lived could have a huge impact on whether you lived or died. People noticed that those living on hills or in higher areas didn't get sick as often. While no one at the time understood bacteria or infection, they still saw patterns. They knew that lower, swampy areas with bad smells often meant more sickness. Rats and fleas loved cities and wet, lowland places. The warmer, wetter air made it easy for them to survive. Higher areas were colder, windier, and less comfortable for rats and fleas. Food was also harder to find in these places, so rodents didn't hang around as much. The fresh air was also helpful. While people thought bad air caused the plague, being in a place with cleaner breezes did help. In one way, it kept them out of the gross, crowded, stinking cities where the disease spread quickly. Some lucky people already lived in these higher places. Monasteries and manors were often built on hills, not because of the plague, but because it was harder for enemies to attack from below. But once the Black Death began to spread, these places became safe zones. If you lived far from everyone else and had your own food and water supply, you didn't need to leave. That made you much safer than someone who had to go into town for food or visit neighbors. People also started realizing that it wasn't just about where you lived, but how many people lived near you. The more neighbors you had, the greater your risk. People started avoiding visitors. If someone from the valley showed up coughing and saying they just had a cold, you had every reason to turn them away or even roll a barrel downhill to keep them out. Survival often meant being firm, even rude. Now, let's talk about personal habits. The average medieval person didn't love bathing. In fact, by the 14th century, Regular baths were seen as dangerous by many. Earlier times had public bathhouses, but those had mostly gone out of fashion. Some thought hot water opened your pores to bad air. Others thought washing removed natural protection from disease. It sounds strange today, but that was the belief. This meant many people didn't wash for weeks. Their skin was oily, their clothes were filthy, and their bodies were perfect places for fleas to settle in. Fleas didn't need much to thrive, just warmth, a host, and some dirty fabric. People who bathed, even once in a while, had a better chance of avoiding flea bites. They didn't know it, but by keeping their skin and clothes cleaner, they were also keeping themselves safer. Soap was made from ashes and fat. It wasn't common, and it smelled pretty bad by today's standards. Still, some used it. A few even bathed in herbs, vinegar, or wine. While that didn't kill germs, it made them smell strong, and sometimes people stayed away from them just because they smelled so weird. That might have saved lives. If people thought you were odd or had strange hygiene habits, they avoided you. In a time of deadly disease, being avoided was actually a good thing. Let's not forget laundry. Most people didn't wash their clothes often. They might change outfits once a month if they were lucky. Clothes were expensive and hard to clean. You couldn't just throw them in a machine. You had to beat them against rocks, boil them, or scrub them by hand. But those who took the time to clean their clothes, especially with hot water, were unknowingly killing fleas and other pests. Changing your clothes once a week was seen as extreme, but in plague times, it could be the difference between life and death. Dental hygiene wasn't great either, but some people chewed mint leaves or rubbed salt on their teeth. It didn't help with the plague, but it did make it easier to talk to others without making them gag. And again, the fewer people who wanted to be close to you, the better your chances. So, what about calling a doctor? Surely that would help, right? Sadly, no. Evil doctors meant well, but they didn't understand what was going on. The top medical idea of the time was the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed if you were sick, your humors were out of balance. The cure? Usually bloodletting. They'd cut you open or use leeches to suck out blood. This weakened patients and often sped up death instead of preventing it. Other treatments were just as bad. Some doctors prescribed crushed emeralds or garlic paste. Others told patients to sit in smoky rooms, rub onions on their bodies, or carry dead toads in a bag. Plague doctors wore bird-like masks filled with herbs, thinking good smells would block bad air. They poked people with sticks from a distance. Their strange outfits looked spooky, but they were actually early attempts at protective gear. Some people even believed that the disease was a punishment from God. So, instead of medicine, they prayed, whipped themselves in the streets, or blamed others. Religious groups called flagellants traveled from town to town, punishing themselves and spreading fear. Sadly, they often made things worse by gathering crowds and increasing the risk of infection. Ironically, people who avoided doctors didn't go to religious parades and instead stayed home with their pets or family had better chances. Nuns, midwives, and herbalists, people who didn't use wild medical tricks, often focused on basic hygiene, clean bandages, and calm care. These simple methods were more effective than most official treatments. So what job you had also mattered. If you were a messenger, merchant, or anyone who traveled between towns, your risk was very high. You had to meet strangers, touch goods, and move through infected areas. Every letter you delivered or market you visited increased your exposure. But jobs like shepherds, blacksmiths, and farmers were safer. These people worked outside, dealt more with animals than people, and didn't need to travel. They stayed in their own areas and had little contact with the sick. Even gravediggers had better odds. It sounds odd, but they had tools, gloves, and experience with the disease. They learned how to spot symptoms and how to stay away from danger. Hermits and people who lived alone with animals were also more likely to survive. They didn't socialize much, didn't visit town, and kept their distance. In normal times, they might have been seen as strange, but during the Black Death, their antisocial lifestyle looked very wise. Even simple things like how you stored your food could affect your survival. If you left bread on the floor or grain in open baskets, rats would come. And with rats came fleas. Some people got clever. They stored food in hanging baskets or jars on high shelves, places where rats couldn't reach. They didn't do this to fight the plague, they just wanted to keep rats out, but it helped. Cats were another secret weapon. Cats hunted rats. More cats meant fewer rodents, which meant fewer fleas, and a lower chance of catching the plague. Sadly, in some areas, cats were killed because people believed they were witches' pets. That made the rat problem worse. Getting rid of your best defense was not a smart move. Trash was a big problem too. Throwing food scraps out the window or keeping waste piles near your home brought rats closer. Smart people kept garbage far from their homes, or better yet, threw it into a neighbor's yard. Not nice, but sometimes effective. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. During the Black Death, people didn't just suffer from disease, they suffered from fear. The sickness came quickly and killed many. But just as scary was what people did when they were afraid. When something horrible happens and no one understands why, many people look for someone to blame. They stop thinking clearly. They let fear guide their actions. And that's when things get even worse. Back in the 1300s, there was no clear idea of what caused the plague. Some people thought it was a punishment from God. Others blamed the air, the weather, or strange events in the sky. But many looked for someone more specific to blame, people who looked or acted differently. In towns across Europe, angry mobs formed. People pointed fingers at outsiders, travelers, and even neighbors who hadn't gotten sick. Some accused the Jewish community of poisoning wells. Others accused foreigners, poor women, or people with strange pets or herbs. In many places, these accusations led to violence. Homes were burned. Innocent people were chased out of town or even killed. Townspeople thought that getting rid of suspicious people would protect them. But of course, this didn't stop the disease. In fact, gathering in mobs to attack someone only brought people closer together, exactly what the plague needed to spread. These violent outbursts weren't just morally wrong, they were deadly. When people got angry and scared, they acted fast and thought slowly. They created big crowds, shouted, and came into close contact with each other. In other words, they created the perfect conditions for the plague to keep spreading. And in many cases, the people who led these mobs died soon after. The ones who stayed home, stayed quiet, and minded their own business, they often survived. There's an important lesson here. In times of crisis, panic is as dangerous as the disease itself. Fear spreads fast, and it can turn smart people into dangerous ones. The plague didn't just test your body, it tested your character. If you could stay calm, avoid the crowd, and think clearly, you had a better chance. Some people understood this. They didn't blame others or start fires. They shut their doors, boiled their water, and kept a low profile. They weren't loud. They weren't flashy. They were just careful, and they lived. Now, let's talk about some of the stranger things people did to try to stay safe. One popular item was garlic. Yes, garlic. People hung it in their homes, wore it around their necks, and even ate large amounts of it, hoping it would protect them. Garlic has a strong smell, and back then, people believed that strong smells could push away the bad air that carried the plague. Oddly enough, garlic isn't completely useless. Today, we know it has mild antibacterial properties. It's not a cure for the plague, but it might have made people less attractive to fleas. Also, if you smelled like garlic all the time, other people might have avoided you. That meant fewer chances of getting infected. Of course, garlic wasn't a magic shield. If you wore garlic but still went to crowded festivals, wore filthy clothes, and shared cups with sick people, it wouldn't save you. You'd just die with bad breath. So, garlic helped only if you were already being smart in other ways. Another common item was the posse, or flower bundle. People carried small bags of herbs and flowers like rosemary, mint, and lavender. These were used to cover up the terrible smells in towns where people were dying in the streets. People stuffed them in their clothes or masks, hoping they would protect them from disease. Did these work? Not really, but they helped in one way. They made people feel safer, and if carrying flowers made you stay calm and avoid panic, that could actually improve your odds. Plus, people who could afford herbs and flowers were often the same people who could afford clean homes, good food, and isolation. So the flowers didn't save them, but their lifestyle did. Some people burned incense or simmered herbs over fires. This made their homes smell better and may have helped clear the air a little. It didn't cure anything, but it showed that they were trying to stay healthy, and sometimes that effort led to better habits, like cleaning and staying indoors. Let's take a moment to think about human contact. Today, when someone gets sick, we know to stay home, rest, and avoid others. But back then, people didn't have that knowledge. They still went to funerals, weddings, and church gatherings. These events were packed with people, many of whom were already sick, but didn't know it yet. Hugging, kissing hands, sharing cups, these simple acts were actually very risky. The truth is, one of the best survival strategies was to be boring. That's right, boring. People who lived quiet lives, skipped festivals, and kept to themselves had the best chances. The neighbor who always said, "maybe later," and never showed up. Alive. The old couple who never visited town and just talked to their chickens, also alive. The shy girl who didn't have many friends, probably alive too. Even inside families, people had to be careful. If someone started coughing or looking pale, they were often sent to a separate part of the house. If the family was poor and didn't have multiple rooms, the sick person might be told to sleep in the barn. It sounds cruel, but it could save the rest of the family. Some wealthy homes had separate wings or guest houses. These were used as early quarantine rooms. If a servant got sick, they were moved far away from everyone else. And if anyone else showed signs of illness, they were isolated immediately. This didn't always work, but it showed that people were starting to understand the importance of space. Monasteries and noble homes sometimes went even further. They closed their gates, limited visitors, and stopped all travel. Everyone who lived inside was expected to stay there, with no exceptions. This wasn't always possible, especially for the poor, but the idea was smart. Limit contact, limit risk. Still, even if you did everything right, washed, avoided people, and lived up on a hill, you might still get sick. That's because fleas didn't care about your manners. All it took was one bite. Some people just got unlucky, but even luck had its limits. If you were careful and boring, your odds were better than the person who went into town every week to visit their cousin or pick up fresh bread. Some people had another advantage: their bodies. Today, scientists believe certain people carried genetic mutations that made them more resistant to the plague. One such gene is called CAR532. People with this gene may have had natural protection against the plague. Of course, no one in the 14th century knew this. They just thought it was strange that some people never got sick. But this tiny genetic difference may have saved entire families. So, let's recap. If you were quiet, cautious, a little antisocial, and perhaps genetically lucky, you stood a good chance of surviving. If you were outgoing, curious, or loved to attend public events, the odds weren't in your favor. In plague times, boring was beautiful. Surviving the Black Death was no small feat. If you made it through the coughing, fevers, bleeding, and unbearable loss, you were not just lucky, you were part of history. But once the worst had passed, a new challenge appeared. What now? People who lived through the plague had to face the aftermath. Entire neighborhoods were empty. Markets were closed. Friends, neighbors, and family members were gone. The streets were quieter, but not in a peaceful way, in a heavy, haunting silence. Survivors had to rebuild not just their homes, but their lives. And many of them had one big question: will anyone remember this? That's where writing came in. Those who could read and write picked up their pens, quills, and began recording what they had seen. They wrote diaries, stories, and even small notes in the margins of religious books. These writings told of what they went through, what they saw, and how they survived. Some wrote to express their grief. Others wrote to share what they had learned, and some simply wrote to prove they had lived. One famous example is Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian writer. He lived in Florence during the Black Death and saw the terrible things it did to his city. He later wrote a book called The Decameron, a collection of stories told by a group of people who fled the city to wait out the plague in the countryside. Through these stories, Boccaccio captured the fears, the mistakes, and even the humor that people used to cope with the crisis. His work gave future generations a window into what life was like during one of the darkest times in history. Other records were simpler. A monk in Yorkshire, England, scribbled a short note in the margin of a book. A great pestilence came, and many died. Just a few words, but those words were proof that someone had lived through it and wanted others to know. Writing served many purposes. For some, it helped them heal. For others, it was a way to teach future generations how to survive something similar. And for many, it was about leaving a legacy. They had survived, and they wanted that survival to mean something. In a time when so many were forgotten, being remembered was powerful. But here's the tricky part. To write your story, you had to stay alive long enough to tell it. That meant not rushing back into danger. After the first wave of the plague passed, people were eager to return to normal. They missed their friends, their festivals, their community. Some declared the plague over too early. Cities reopened, people gathered again, and tragically a second wave hit. Many who had survived the first outbreak died in the second because they let their guard down. They hugged neighbors, they shared food, they went back to the market, thinking the danger had passed. But the plague wasn't done. It was just waiting. The ones who truly survived were the ones who stayed careful, in after it seemed safe. So if you really wanted to survive and leave a mark, the smartest move was to wait, stay cautious, keep writing. Don't go back to town just because the church bells started ringing again. Don't drink from the public fountain just because someone said, "It's probably fine now." Instead, stay home, listen, and observe. And when you were certain it was safe, really safe, then, and only then, pick up your pen. Some survivors wrote detailed journals. Others kept short lists of who had died in their village. A few drew pictures or left behind items with names and dates. It didn't matter how simple or fancy the record was. What mattered was that anyone had taken the time to make a note of it. To say, "I was here, I lived through this, and here's what I saw." Even if no one read it during their lifetime, their words could survive for centuries. And they did. Historians today still read those old documents to understand what the Black Death was really like. They learned from the people who were there. So in a way, those quiet survivors won twice. They didn't just escape death, they became part of the story that history never forgot. Now, let's turn to a different topic. What about people who were already struggling with their minds before or during the plague? Today, we call it mental illness. But back then, it had many different names, and most of them were wrong. In ancient times, mental illness wasn't seen as a medical issue. It was often viewed as something spiritual or supernatural. People who heard voices or behaved oddly were thought to be possessed by demons or punished by gods. In places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, there were no psychiatrists. There were only priests and shamans who performed rituals, said prayers, or gave potions to drive out the evil spirits they believed were inside the person. The Greeks brought a new idea. Thinkers like Hippocrates believed that mental health was about balance, just like physical health. They thought the body had 4 fluids, or humors, and if those got out of balance, you could become sick or even mentally unstable. While this theory wasn't completely right, it was a big step forward. At least it didn't blame spirits or curses. Then came the Middle Ages in Europe. Sadly, a lot of progress was lost. The church had a powerful influence, and many mental illnesses were seen once again as signs of sin or possession. People who were depressed or confused were often thought to be under the control of the devil. Instead of getting help, they were locked away, beaten, or worse. Some were accused of witchcraft, especially if they were women with knowledge of herbs or healing. Hospitals for the mentally ill were rare. One of the earliest was Bethlehem Hospital in London, better known as Bedlam. it quickly became more of a prison than a place of healing. Patients were chained, dunked in cold water, or starved. People even paid money to walk through and look at them, as if they were animals in a zoo. But not everywhere was like this. In some parts of the Islamic world, doctors treated mental illness more gently. They used music, fresh air, and conversation to help. In Moorish Spain and the Middle East, there were even hospitals that treated mental illness with some care and dignity. Unfortunately, this kind of approach didn't spread quickly to Europe. During the Renaissance, some thinkers tried to bring back old Greek ideas. They spoke of balance again, natural causes rather than sin. But old beliefs died hard. Many people still feared what they didn't understand. The mentally ill were still often hidden away or punished instead of treated. By the time of the Enlightenment, the world was beginning to change. Science and reason were gaining ground, and mental illness began to be seen as a medical condition. Again, doctors started keeping notes, studying behaviors, and asking questions. But treatment was still rough. Ice baths, spinning chairs, and electric shocks were used in hopes of resetting the brain. Some doctors wanted to be kind. A French physician named Philippe Pinel famously removed the chains from patients at a hospital in Paris. He believed that people deserved respect, not torture. In England, a Quaker-run place called the York Retreat offered calm surroundings and gentle care. These were important steps toward better treatment. Even so, the mentally ill were often forgotten or feared. Families hid them away. Governments built large institutions in the countryside to keep them out of sight. And while some doctors wanted to help, many saw their patients as broken machines rather than people. The survivors of the plague and of life itself deserved more. Whether you faced physical disease or mental struggles, your story mattered. And for those who survived long enough to tell it, their words shaped history. They reminded us of what went wrong, what went right, and what must never be repeated. As Europe moved into the 1800s, also known as the Victorian era, the world was changing rapidly. New machines were being invented. Science was starting to replace superstition. Cities grew. Medicine advanced. But when it came to understanding mental illness, people were still deeply confused and often cruel. In the Victorian world, people cared a lot about appearances. They believed in manners, politeness, and control. Showing strong emotions in public, especially if you were a woman, was considered shameful. So when someone suffered from mental illness, when they cried for no reason, heard voices, or couldn't stop panicking, society didn't want to see it. Families often hid their loved ones away, locking them in back rooms or sending them to asylums. Mental illness was seen as a stain on a family's reputation. For women, things were especially unfair. A woman who didn't want to marry, or who showed too much emotion, could be labeled as hysterical. That word comes from the Greek word for uterus, showing how people wrongly believed that only women had emotional problems. Doctors said women needed to rest, avoid books, and stay in bed. Some were even forced to stop talking, writing, or thinking too deeply. Their minds were treated as fragile and their independence was treated as dangerous. One famous writer, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, experienced this herself. She was told to stop working and lie in bed for weeks. The treatment nearly drove her mad. She later wrote a powerful short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, describing a woman who slowly loses her mind while trapped in a room with no freedom. The story was based on her own life, and it helped people understand just how damaging that kind of treatment could be. Meanwhile, doctors like Jean-Martin Charcot in France were putting on dramatic shows. He would hypnotize women in front of large audiences, trying to demonstrate how hysteria worked. People watched these performances like they were theater. One of his students, a young man named Sigmund Freud, took notes. Freud would later become famous for creating psychoanalysis, the idea that talking about your past could help cure your mind. Asylums were growing everywhere. These were large hospitals for the mentally ill, but many were more like prisons. They were placed far from cities, hidden behind tall walls. Patients were locked inside for years. Some never left. While a few asylums offered kind care, most were overcrowded, underfunded, and full of suffering. People with epilepsy, alcoholism, grief, or simply old age were all lumped together. The goal wasn't really to heal, it was to keep them out of sight. If you were declared insane, it could be nearly impossible to prove otherwise. All it took was a doctor's signature or a husband's claim, and you could be sent away. Women, in particular, had very little power. If a man wanted to get rid of his wife or daughter, he could say she was hysterical or delusional, and that was enough. Mental illness became a tool for control. The idea of moral treatment became popular. This meant that people could get better by following rules, keeping a schedule, and behaving properly. Patients were told to wake up early, make their beds, dress neatly, and attend church. If they followed the routine, doctors believed they were improving. But this wasn't always helpful. People who were deeply troubled weren't being treated, they were being trained to act normal, even if they were still suffering inside. Still, a few good examples stood out. The York Retreat in England, run by Quakers, believed in kindness and peace. They offered gardens, quiet time, and respect. Patients were treated like people, not prisoners. But places like this were rare. By the end of the 1800s, doctors began to collect real data. They wrote down symptoms, tracked patient progress, and tried to understand how different treatments worked. Psychiatry, the medical field focused on mental health, was slowly becoming a science. But progress was slow, and mistakes were common. Then came the 20th century, and with it, war. World War I changed everything. Soldiers came home not just with physical wounds, but with invisible ones. Many couldn't sleep. They jumped at loud noises. They forgot names. They wept for no reason. Back then, it was called shell shock. Doctors thought maybe the explosions had shaken their brains. But soon, they realized something deeper was going on. These men were traumatized. For the first time, society began to understand that mental illness wasn't just for women or the poor, it could affect anyone. Even heroes, even the strongest. Some military doctors, like Dr. Rivers in Britain, began new kinds of treatment. Instead of punishing or ignoring the soldiers, they listened to them. They asked about their dreams, their memories, and their feelings. One of Rivers' patients, the famous poet Siegfried Sassoon, wrote powerful verses about his pain. These poems helped others see the truth of war and the damage it caused. Sadly, many soldiers with shell shock were not treated kindly. Some were called cowards. A few were even executed for desertion, even though they were clearly suffering. Still, the war opened people's eyes. Trauma was real, and it needed care, not shame. World War II came next, and doctors were a little better prepared. They renamed shell shock as combat fatigue and tried to help soldiers rest and recover. Some made real progress, but the stigma remained. Many men still felt they had to hide their suffering to look strong. In the years that followed, psychiatry took a strange and often frightening turn. Instead of focusing on talk or rest, many doctors turned to machines and surgery. They wanted to fix the brain directly, but what they did was often dangerous. One of the most infamous treatments was the lobotomy. This involved cutting parts of the brain, often through the eye socket. The goal was to stop people from feeling angry, sad, or confused. But in reality, it often left patients silent, helpless, or unable to care for themselves. Some died. Others became shadows of their former selves. Another treatment was electroshock therapy. Doctors would send electric currents through the brain, hoping to reset it. Sometimes it helped people with severe depression, but often, it caused memory loss, pain, and fear, especially when done without consent or care. Despite these horrors, not everything was bad. In the 1950s, new medicines were discovered. Drugs like Thorazine helped people with severe mental illness calm their minds. For the first time, people could live outside hospitals with the help of medication. This led to a major change. Governments around the world began to close large mental institutions. They promised to build smaller community centers where people could get help while living normal lives. This was called deinstitutionalization. It sounded like a good idea. No more giant asylums. No more hidden suffering. But there was a problem. Many of the promised clinics were never built. Funding was cut. Support systems failed. Thousands of people were released from hospitals with nowhere to go. Many ended up homeless. Others were sent to jail instead of receiving treatment. Prisons became the new asylums, places where people with mental illness were locked up, but not cared for. It was a painful reminder that good intentions aren't enough. Real change takes planning, compassion, and effort. Still, the idea that people with mental illness deserved freedom, respect, and care didn't go away. It grew. Movements for mental health rights began. People spoke out. Former patients shared their stories. Advocates pushed for better laws and better access to treatment. By the end of the 20th century, therapy had become more accepted. Medications were safer and more effective. And mental illness was finally being talked about in public, not as something to hide, but something to understand. As the 21st century began, the world became more connected than ever before. People could talk to each other across the globe using phones, video calls, and social media. Information was everywhere. Healthcare, technology, and science made huge leaps forward. Yet, even with all this progress, mental health remained a difficult topic for many. More people were talking about it, yes. More doctors knew how to help, but stigma, that quiet, heavy feeling of shame, still hung in the air. Many people were still afraid to say, "I'm struggling." They worried about losing their jobs, their friends, or their families. They thought others would see them as weak or broken. And so, in the past, many people suffered in silence. Even the language we used made things harder. Calling someone crazy or insane wasn't just mean it built walls. It made people feel like they didn't belong. They were different in the worst possible way. And for a long time, those words were common in jokes, movies, and even news reports. But change was coming. Slowly, more public figures began to speak out. Celebrities, athletes, and writers shared their stories. They talked about depression, anxiety, addiction, and trauma. By opening up, they helped others feel less alone. If someone famous could struggle with mental health, maybe it wasn't something to be ashamed of after all. Schools began teaching children about mental health, at least in some parts of the world. They explained that the brain, like the body, can get tired or sick. That needing help didn't mean failure, it meant strength. And just like you'd go to a doctor for a broken arm, you could go to a therapist for a broken heart or mind. Therapies also improved. There were now many ways to treat mental health: talk therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness, art therapy, and more. Different people needed different approaches. And finally, there were options. Medication also became safer and more targeted. While not perfect, modern medicine gave people more tools than ever to manage conditions like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and PTSD. Support groups grew in popularity. These weren't led by doctors, but by people who had gone through similar struggles. Sitting in a room or even in an online chat with others who understood could be incredibly healing. People shared advice, cried together, laughed together, and reminded each other that healing takes time. Workplaces started taking mental health more seriously, too. Companies began offering mental health days, creating quiet spaces, and offering therapy through health plans. While not every business supported this idea, the trend was growing. The idea that happy, healthy employees work better began to spread. But even with all these improvements, not everyone had access to help. In many countries, mental health care was expensive or hard to find. Some areas had no therapists at all. People in rural communities, low-income neighborhoods, or crowded cities often had to wait months for an appointment. Others were told to pray, ignore the problem, or just be strong. And then, something happened that affected the entire world: COVID-19. The global pandemic brought fear, sickness, and isolation to billions of people. Lockdowns, job losses, and endless worry pushed mental health to the edge. People were stuck inside. Some were alone. Others were trapped in unsafe homes. Many lost loved ones. Even those who had never struggled with anxiety or depression before began to feel the weight. But something good came from this crisis, too. People finally realized that mental health was not a side issue, it was essential. You could be healthy in your body but still feel broken inside. And now, more than ever, the world saw that clearly. During the pandemic, online therapy became more common. Apps, video calls, and text-based counseling helped people get support from home. Mental health hotlines saw record numbers of calls. And slowly, more governments began investing in care, support, and awareness. Even kids were part of the conversation. Children learned how to name their feelings. Teachers checked in with their students' emotions. Parents were told to talk to their kids, not just about grades and chores, but about sadness, fear, and loneliness. Meanwhile, artists, musicians, and writers used their work to express pain and hope. Films and books featured characters with real mental health struggles, not as villains or jokes, but as people, honest, flawed, and brave. This helped shape new generations who saw therapy not as something to be embarrassed about, but as a normal part of life. Still, the fight is far from over. Many people, especially in poor or conservative areas, still believe mental illness is a weakness or punishment. Some think it's something you can pray away or ignore. Others feel guilty or ashamed and hide their pain. Even in wealthy countries, the support systems aren't always strong. There are still too many people in jail or on the streets who should be in care, not punishment. Many young people still fear speaking up, and even with modern treatments, side effects and misdiagnoses are common. There's still a long way to go. But here's the good news. The world is waking up. People are sharing, listening, learning. Mental health is no longer a secret or a shame or a sign of failure. It's part of being human. It's part of being alive. And the stories we tell, from the survivors of the Black Death to the voices of today, are the proof that healing is possible, that kindness matters, and that even the quietest life can leave a lasting mark. So, what can we learn from all of this? Whether you're trying to survive a deadly plague or just trying to survive a bad day, the same lessons still apply. Be kind, be clean, be careful, think for yourself, listen to your body, don't be afraid to ask for help, and most importantly, don't give up. The people who survived the darkest times weren't always the strongest or the richest. They were often the ones who stayed calm, used common sense, took care of themselves and others, and held on to hope, even when everything seemed hopeless. That's the real secret to survival. Not magic, not luck, just small, smart choices, one day at a time. And when we make those choices, we don't just survive, we create a better world for those who come after us. Now that we've taken this journey from the 14th century to today, we can see something clearly. The people who survived were not always the fastest, the strongest, or the richest. They were the quiet ones, the cautious ones, the ones who watched, listened, and adapted. They paid attention to what was happening around them, and they made smart choices. Sometimes, those choices look small, like moving to the countryside, skipping a festival, washing their hands, or staying home. But those small choices saved lives. In every time period, from the days of the plague to modern pandemics, from ancient myths about madness to today's therapy apps, people have always struggled with sickness. Sometimes it was sickness of the body, sometimes it was the mind, sometimes it was fear itself. But no matter the form, the key to survival has often been the same. Stay alert, stay kind, and stay connected to what's real. One of the most powerful lessons from the Black Death is that fear can spread faster than disease. And when fear turns into anger, blame, or panic, people stop thinking clearly. They turn on each other. They make things worse. History shows us this again and again. Mobs that attacked the innocent, governments that denied science, communities that isolated the very people who needed help. These mistakes weren't just dangerous, they were deadly. And yet, at the same time, we see the quiet heroes, the ones who closed their doors early, who shared garlic and herbs with their neighbors, who stayed with the sick and washed their faces, even if they didn't know exactly why. They didn't always write books or make speeches. Many were never remembered by name, but their choices helped shape the future. In the story of mental health, the quiet survivors are just as important. These are the people who dared to ask for help, even when the world told them to be silent. The ones who wrote down their pain in poems and journals. The ones who turned their suffering into songs, paintings, and stories. The ones who refused to be defined by their diagnosis, and instead helped others find hope. They didn't always wear white coats. They didn't have medals, but they changed lives starting with their own. There are also the caregivers, the monks who kept records, the nuns who changed bandages with gentle hands, the midwives who boiled cloths and whispered, "Comfort." The early doctors who, even without perfect tools, did their best to heal. The teachers who taught children how to breathe, how to talk about their feelings. The friends who stayed on the phone during a panic attack. The strangers who left flowers on doorsteps. We don't always hear about them, but they're there in every time, in every story, in every place where someone decided to care instead of judge. So, what can we do now with all this knowledge? First, we remember. We remember that people died not because they were weak or bad, but because they didn't have the tools we have today. They didn't know how germs worked. They didn't have antibiotics, vaccines, or therapy, but they tried, and their efforts, right or wrong, taught us something. Next, we respect science, but we also respect each other. Medicine saves lives, but so does listening. So does staying calm in a crisis. So does treating the anxious and the grieving with kindness instead of shame. Whether someone is recovering from a virus or a breakdown, they deserve care. We also speak up. Silence has never saved anyone from disease or depression. When we talk about what's hurting us, whether it's in our lungs or in our thoughts, we make it easier for others to speak too. And the more people speak, the less power stigma has. We prepare. Pandemics may come again. So may economic troubles, wars, or climate disasters. But history shows us that preparation is not just about storing food or building hospitals. It's about teaching people how to take care of themselves and others. It's about emotional strength, not just physical supplies. And it's about knowing when to slow down, step back, and make space to breathe. And finally, we share. We pass on the stories, like Boccaccio did after the plague, like war poets did after the trenches, like mental health survivors do every day, online and in therapy groups. We tell the truth, even when it's messy, even when it's painful, because stories remind us that we are not alone. Imagine this. Somewhere, years from now, a young person opens a book, reads an old blog, or hears a podcast, and learns that someone just like them once faced something terrifying and made it through. That's the power of survival. Not just living, but helping someone else live. 2.so if you're reading this today, know this. Survival isn't about being perfect. It's about trying. It's about paying attention. It's about resting when you're tired and reaching out when you're scared. It's about saying, I don't know what to do, but I want to do better. And if you've ever struggled with fear, with grief, with a racing heart, or a heavy sadness, you're not weak. You're human, just like the monks, the midwives, the poets, and the plague survivors. You are part of a long line of people who faced the dark and kept walking. The world doesn't need more heroes who never cry. It needs more people who care, who listen, who light a candle when others are afraid of the dark. You can be one of them. You already are.